Welcome to Vet SOS Podcast. Remember, don't drown the sea of transition. Grab the Vet SOS Lifeline. Vet SOS is brought to you by the Who You Know Network and is a proud member of the Parade Deck community. We can now be heard on Reach Across America Radio on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Eastern. You can find Reach Across America Radio on iHeart, Odyssey, and the TuneIn apps. Today, we're sitting down with Wendi Wray. She is doing wonderful work to support our veteran community. Can't wait to get into this discussion, see what all she has her hands in. Back in action today, Keith. How's it going?
It's good to be back, Sean. It's great to be here. As always, I love these things, and I'm really excited for today's episode.
All right. Well, let's jump right into it. Wendi is a woman of God, wife and mama of 3, Army veteran, and a passionate advocate for women veterans. I don't think you can ask for anything more right there. Her mission is to guide women from feeling uncertain to confident in their new identity as a woman professional. I love the fact that you kept your bio short, brief, to the point. There's no bones about it. We know exactly what you're standing for. How are you doing today, Wendi?
I'm doing great, Sean. Thank you so much for both of you having me here. I feel like I'm getting the best of both worlds here. I typically only interview with one host, but today I'm getting 2. So I'm excited and honestly just ready to share what I can based on my experience with your audience. And I've been tuning into these episodes and you have wonderful guests. So I am honored to be here. Thank you, Sean.
We're so happy to have you. And I have to have a co-host. I'm just not big enough to do this on my own. Keith carries the show as he knows. He'll fight that to the end, but
until Eric fires me again.
Yeah, there you go. All right, so let's jump right into this with your transition story. Tell us how your transition went.
Yeah, so it was actually not as daunting as I would imagine. I know most of us have, or most members have, regardless of what branch you're in, right? So I actually was working on getting out about 2 years before I even submitted my packet. But by that, I mean, I was mentally and emotionally getting ready. And so by that, I already kind of lined up some resources like the mental and emotional. I was going to therapy. I was making sure that I wasn't getting out for the wrong reasons, right? And so eventually there was a different plan for us. So we were dual military, and we then decided that one of us wasn't going to be the best option for our family, essentially, to stay in. And at the time we were at Fort Drum, New York. And so not only did the weather, the location had a lot to do with our decision. For those of you, I don't know, Keith, Sean, if you've been stationed there.
Keith's from Buffalo.
I'm not from Buffalo. I'm from the east side, but I'm from upstate New York, and my son was actually stationed at Drum as well. So I'm very, very familiar with the area.
So and I still don't know how you survived living there. I mean, I guess it's just, the nature of the beast there. But, we then figured out, we kind of did our little COA that we typically do in the military, right? Or making sure that we knew exactly what was going to work out, but there's never a right plan. And so as I was getting, my education, I was like, well, let me get my master's degree. Let me make sure I have everything. I'm equipped with my education. Financially, I started paying, all my credit card debt. Thankfully, I didn't have that much at the time. And so I was able to feel confident to submit in my packet. Finally did. And that's really when it all started. The emotional, the mental chaos started to kick in. And the reason I bring this up, because we underestimate this part of the transition. And for me, it was something that I started to highlight even more, because that's when I started about learning about the self-help, really getting into the therapy of what really triggers us, right? Like what's going to get us into a successful transition or just successful new chapter of our lives. Yeah. And so that's when I started listening to podcasts. I started exploring what resources, programs were out there. And so I waited to the last minute, to be honest. I'm like, okay, I'm doing all of this, but I also want to stay busy with work to help me kind of forget that I'm getting out. So I was one of the officers that didn't want to go to the VA, or not the VA, but get my medical stuff taken care of. I was like, no, I need to be here. I need to make sure that, my S1 shop is still, good to go and everyone's being taken care of but myself. And so I will highlight that was one of the issues at first for me. I wasn't taking care of myself. And then later on, I realized that was the biggest issue. And so when I was transitioning, literally 2 months or actually 6 weeks before my transition leave, I decided to look at recruiting firms who could help me. Because at that time, I was honestly desperate at not knowing what opportunities were for me, not knowing what I was going to get into, because I was pretty much in shock. And so essentially, I was able to get an opportunity as a recruiter with that firm. And that's really what changed my entire outlook of what the opportunities were for veterans, but also the preparation that came along with going into those opportunities into the corporate sector. And so when I was getting out, I'm like, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to help veterans. And being that my background was in HR, I knew I wanted to continue to be in the people business. And so for me, that meant, I'm a recruiter. I'm going to continue to stay into the HR field as I go into the corporate sector. So then I can also continue to give back. And that's kind of how the podcast started, helping veterans Beyond the Military podcast, and also how my coaching began with focusing on career coaching. At first I started with veterans, but then I noticed that there was more of a need for women to shed some light on women veterans, and in hopes to continue to build a community where women can not only talk about their personal issues as a mom, as a wife, or just simply as the leader, or maybe just wanting to take a knee and go into a career field that's probably completely different, right? So that's where all of this whole career coaching focus on women began, because I didn't really have that when I was getting out. And I wish someone would have said, take care of your family if that's what you want to do. That's okay, right? Like that's also a full-time job. If anything, it's more than a full-time job. And so that's what I want to continue to advocate for women. If you need to take a year off, and by that, it could be education, it could be just you taking a break and figuring out what you want to do. That's what I love to emphasize and to continue to encourage women to do, because not all of us want to have kids. Not all of us want to go into corporate. Not all of us want to continue and get our master's or our PhD. Some of us possibly just want to volunteer, or how do we give back in a different way, right? Because we're finding our purpose. We're trying to figure out what's next for us. And so that's a little bit about how I went about my transition and how I am here today, continuing to advocate through my podcast and also through coaching.
That's fantastic. And you hit on several things, but a couple of those things that jumped out at me were like the day I decided to retire, I felt like this huge weight lifted off my shoulders. But then the next day I'm like, well, crap, now what do I do?
Right.
So it's a whole new level of stress that comes in here. I also, Keith, I guess we have to stay away from the S1 jokes since we got an S1 officer in our presence here. So,
oh, those never get old. I still get them. So I still get them. They're like, wait, my packet has not been approved yet. Or, oh, finally the S1 decided to approve my packet. Retirement.
Yeah. And I not love, don't get me wrong, it's probably the wrong word, but you started preparing so early. And then I honed in on the fact that you're like, I needed a break. Like what I heard was I need to check out from checking out. Right. Like,
yes.
and that's honestly, that's a double-edged sword, because I remember doing the same thing. It was like, there was times where I didn't want to deal with, like Sean said, right, the weight of transition hits, and it hits like a flood, and that's mentally taxing. So it's like, you got to almost take a break from that, but then there's that fine balance. And, I will say, it sounds like you were blessed enough though to have the opportunity to check in and check back out, whether maybe you didn't do it quite as evenly as you wanted to, but let's face it, there's a lot of commands out there that don't allow their service members the flexibility to check in and or check out, right? I've heard way too many service members, it's just their command wouldn't let them do what they needed to do to prepare for transition. So I'm just throwing that out there for all of our listeners. If you're still in, and especially if you're in charge of troops, let them do what they need to do to transition. That is one of the biggest struggles our service members still face. And it's funny, I can't tell you how many leaders I've come across, they admit to that. They're like, I was that leader. I was making my folks continue coming to work, doing what I needed them to do. And then when it came time for me to transition, I went, holy crap. Like, what did I do to all these people? Because then I realized what I need, so yeah, anyway, I'm rambling.
Yeah. No, Keith, that's a great point, because I wish somebody would have said, Wendi, or at that time, Captain Wray, like, you need to go take care of your stuff. And even if it was from my NCOIC, and I think that they did say it, but it wasn't in a way where, because they weren't getting out, right? So they are also like, we want to make sure that we're all getting the work done, right? We know the mentality, especially with 10th Mountain. And so there isn't any way that we could just say, let's, take a break or leave that for another day, because there's no such thing. Everything was supposed to be done yesterday. And so that is a great point they bring up, Keith, because if you're a leader, for those of you listening, or you know of someone that's also a leader, grab their attention, right? Pull them to the side for a minute and say, hey, Wendi, or hey, Lieutenant or Sergeant so-and-so, you're getting out in the next 90 days. Are you taking care of yourself? And just with that one question, right? And I know sometimes, are you taking care of yourself can mean many things, but are you taking care of your transition? Is there anything I can do to support you? And I know it's hard. Trust me, I get it. I was one of them too, that sometimes I would say, well, we could come in on a Saturday, we could come in on a Sunday and get this done. But if we're not taking care of one another, we're honestly just failing each other for the future, right? And that's not what we're trained to do, right? We take care of each other. And so I know for me, that was something, if I could go back in time, is to say, sir, I really need someone to backfill me, or I really need you to trust my NCOIC or trust the whole team, because I need to go take care of myself. And here's the unfortunate part. I know my leader would have said, yes, go ahead, go do what you have to do. But I just wasn't there to ask, because in my mind, and I know this happens a lot with all of us, right? We want to leave our unit even better than when we first arrived, right? And so like, that's our mentality, and it kind of like it doesn't serve us during our transition. But at the end of the day, I know that it's something that's hard to kind of shy away from, right? We want to leave it better than what it was when we first got there. And so that was my biggest goal for me, was, continue to do the work, continue to, focus on what I need to focus on. And also, let's be honest here, to take away from focusing on what was really the reality, what was coming for me. But I wish somebody would have said that. And again, if you're listening, if that's you, listen, take some time for you, especially if you're a mom, if you are someone that's, trying to handle the home and also work, you need to take a moment and really say, okay, what are my priorities here? Yes, family is definitely number one. How can I ensure that they will be taken care of? What does that look like for a family? And then comes your career.
Yeah, it's funny, because none of us want to be labeled as retired on active duty. We don't want to go through that whole thing that, that we're the dirt bag or whatever. And the truth of the matter is, nobody really understands it until you transition. And, my favorite quote, and it applies so well to transition, is John Maxwell said, don't ever ask directions from someone who's never been there. And as soldiers, we're taught to ask our leaders, and the fact of the matter is, our leaders don't know, because they've never done it. So just that whole piece of it, and it's absolutely crazy. But let's jump into this podcast. What you have, the Beyond the Military podcast. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so I focus on mainly 4 things. I would love for women to come to this podcast and learn not only about their mental and emotional health, but also about their career. And the other category would then be family and faith, depending on what drives them, right? What's their foundation? And so for me, my foundation is my faith and my family. That's what drives me. And so if I can have that understanding and that why behind everything that I do, then now I can focus on my mental and emotional health, then my career or my next thing, right? Because like I said, a career could mean many things. It could be pursuing your education. It could mean starting your own business. It could mean starting a podcast, right? Maybe you're advocating for something that you are possibly even an expert in, right? Or maybe you know much of that topic that you want to share with others. Maybe it's just you building relationships, right? Because we don't do that a lot in the military. And so that is the goal for anyone that is a woman veteran, or even if you're a male and you're like, okay, I stumbled into this podcast, it applies to both. but my focus is women because there's a lot of things that we face that a lot of men don't. For example, we get a lot of self-doubt. I know men get self-doubt too, but you guys show it differently than we do. We kind of shy away, we dim our light. We then try to not go for the opportunity because we're like, we don't have all the skills and all the competencies and all the experience, so we're not going to apply. Versus the guys are like, shoot, I can do it. I have 3 out of the 5. I know I can get this done. And, you apply. And because you're like, I have nothing to lose. And for women, we're like, well, I don't want to, be embarrassed or, continue to strengthen that belief of like, I told you so, Wendy, you shouldn't apply. You don't have the, ability, you don't have the skills. And so we go into this spiral. And so again, for me, it's more understanding what we struggle with and then put a podcast episode for it to help, that is the hopes, to help women to continue to take action. Because when we put on the uniform, we're more confident than when we take it off. And I've spoken to many women, and that is, I want to say 80%. If there's a percentage that could go up there, that is true. When we're in uniform, we have a rank, we have an identity, and we know we have that authority. But when we get out, we have the opportunity to figure out if we want to wear makeup, what color nails do we want? How do we want our hair to be done? And we're like, okay, well, that's great. But then how do I show up with that same authority, right? I'm confident in my military experience, but I'm not confident in this new professional career. And so that's what I want to continue to highlight in this podcast. So if you're listening and you're a woman, regardless of what branch you are in, come tune in. I honestly try to provide you as much value as I can regarding different topics. There was one that I had no idea. I literally it came to mind. And I started talking about the values, focusing on your values, aligning your values with the company. And that podcast episode has had double the downloads than the rejection one, or just, figuring out your goals for after the military. And the reason I think it stood out to a lot of women is because we don't take a moment to pause and say, what am I really valuing here? Right? Like, am I going to really hone in on, the value that I bring, my integrity, the growth that I want for the future, right? In a way where I know I can fulfill that commitment. And so I think that was one of the reasons, but I really try to shed light on topics that you possibly are not even thinking about. And so that's really why I have the podcast. And I also try to post a lot on LinkedIn too, videos. Come follow me there if you haven't already. I promise you'll get at least 1 or 2 that are going to be helpful for you, either through your resume, identifying what you want to do outside of the military, or just interview prep tips. That's what I'm here for.
So Keith, our big focus is to grow the freedom beard or not to grow the freedom beard.
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, and she brought back a memory for me, and maybe women coming out of the military, you are challenged with it in maybe a different capacity. But I remember, I kid you not, so it's technically my second job, but my first main job out of the Army when I got out was I worked at Wells Fargo, and I was a branch manager, and it was a suit and tie business. And my wife literally had to dress me for the first 2 to 3 months in that job, because I didn't know how to color coordinate. I didn't know the socks were supposed to match the tie. The shoes were supposed to match the belt. And it took months. I was like, I don't know how to dress myself. This is awkward. And I'll even say, there's absolutely the stigmas out there and the challenges for women, but even for men listening, like I actually just recently met a guy, my son's who just got out of the Coast Guard himself. He's using his GI Bill and gone back to school, but he's befriended a Marine, or I say former Marine, he says, never a former Marine. Anyway, but he's like, he got out about 8 years ago. He's just been a stay-at-home dad. And he's like, I just wanted to be a stay-at-home dad. I wanted to be Mr. Mom, but now he's like, I'm getting that itch. So now he's going back to school and restarting his career. But all that to say, the women, the statistics prove it, right? The pay gap in the workplace and all these things, women do have a harder time with this kind of stuff. So let me ask this, what would be like because again, all service members, I think, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of us have that existential crisis question of what do I want to be when I grow up, when we get out. So for women especially, what advice would you give those that are having that question in their head right now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And before I answer that, Keith, I just want to say that you are not alone with getting dressed. I literally struggled through that too. And, when on the weekends, that's our time to shine, right? Like the shoes, the purse. But then going into a civilian environment, I was like, oh my gosh, my nails might be too bright. And I love to have like sometimes bright nails. And it's like, no, that's normal. Oh, okay.
Right.
Or is my lip too bright too? And all these things. And again, the self-doubt, but it gets better, I promise. So if you're a lady, yes, dress how you typically dress. And of course, look in your environment. If you work in construction, obviously you're not going to show up in a nice suit, but if you are in corporate, there's definitely something that they have available for you to see what's the left and right habits. Now, regarding your question, so I don't know if you guys hear my dog in the background.
Yeah,
we all have
love
dogs.
Real life. Yeah, we all
exactly.
got dogs.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So identifying what you want is the hardest thing because we're changing into a new identity. That's what it really means, right? We are now in an environment where we can choose and we can you guys hear?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay.
Yep.
Where we can choose what we want to be. And so the biggest recommendation that I give is be honest with yourself. And by that means being honest of where you and your family are going to go. Now, if you're single, this is a lot easier because now it's just you and you're like, I don't have any dependents, or maybe your kids are already adults and your wife, her career, or I'm sorry, your husband, his career, he's allowing you to, give that opportunity to continue to do whatever you need to do. And so essentially what you want to do is have that conversation on what does that look like for us? What does it look for us to grow into this opportunity? Maybe you want to be remote. Maybe you want to go into corporate, into the office. Maybe you want to do both, right? Maybe you want to be hybrid. Relocation, right? Like that's the biggest piece that a lot of families do not are able to figure out right away because they don't know the opportunities. There's remote opportunities. There's hybrid opportunities. And so based on where, your family is best at, going, start there. But you have to be honest with yourself. If you're not, then it's just you're going to have challenges over challenges because just to give you an example, one of the girls that she had a consultation with me and she was explaining to me that her husband was about to deploy. She's dual military. And there was this opportunity available, but it was on site and she had to drive 45 minutes out with a toddler and she was expecting. And so I asked her, well, what is the reality of you being successful? Like if I were to ask you right now, is this something that you could be successful in for the next year or two? And she said no. And I said, don't take that opportunity. You cannot take that opportunity because now you know that you are not going to succeed in that. And so what happens to our mental, our psyche, what happens? They're like, oh, now I'm a failure. I took the opportunity. I sucked at that job, but you really didn't. It's just that you didn't have the bandwidth, right? You were going to be essentially a single mom while your husband's deployed, a child, a toddler, and you're expecting. So you're setting yourself up for failure, not only during this moment, but in the future, because now you're like, okay, how do I explain this gap? Or how do I explain why I left this job within the first 3 months? And there's nothing wrong with that. But again, you being honest from the very beginning, right? Like, what is it that I can do? What is it that I can take? Because if you don't, it's just going to go downhill from there. And so understanding that and then going into the general of what could it be? So for example, if you were logistics in the military or combat arms and you want nothing to do with logistics or nothing to do with anything of, that specific role or even industry, let's say you want to go completely into HR. You're like, I want to do HR. I want to learn more about, human resources. Then go that route. Start looking at certifications, what things could translate, what skills translate into HR. and then certifications that are going to take you possibly weeks to take, not years, and how you can start to educate yourself and looking at programs that are short-term, helpful for you, beneficial for you. So many companies, and for those of you listening, you may not know this, but there are so many companies that offer you even HR certifications or any certification that you're looking for within that industry that the company wants you to take so that you're also are able to, be, so that you can apply for that and actually have a chance to put that on your resume, right? So they have a pipeline that focuses on their certifications, on their events, on anything that you participate in, they track that. And so start there and make sure that you're able to understand what that means, right? And so once, let's say you figure out the general idea of what field you want to go into, then you can start looking at the companies and networking and asking those questions. Because let's say you're like, yeah, I want to go into HR, but then you start talking to Wendy, you start talking to Sean, you start talking to Keith, and they're like, oh, you have to, be willing to do this, and you have to, ensure that you're doing X, Y, Z. And then you may be saying, well, that's not what I want to do. Maybe I should stay in supply, right? And then that's how you start to narrow it down. But you have to go out there and you just have to be willing to learn as much as you can from that field. But you have to start with being honest with yourself. And if you don't start there, everything else is just going to fall, regardless if you find the right opportunity, the right salary, the right location. But if it's not what you and the family or you know that you're able to do with the bandwidth that you have, it's just not going to be long-term success. Yeah. And by that, I mean at least 2 years.
Yeah. And I can concur. I worked with a lot of, and I'll just say stay-at-home parents. They have been mostly women, but they come to me and they're like, I've been a stay-at-home parent for the last 2, 5, 8, 10 years. I can't put anything on my resume. And I'm like, you're a cook, you're a budget analyst, you're an administrative assistant, you do HR, you do supply, you do so much. I'm like, you're an 88 Mike, you're a 92 Alpha, you're all those things. But all that to say, something else that you brought to mind. So we do have to start to wrap this up, which is breaking my heart. But I'm going to ask a hard question. So we're about to show everybody that these questions are unscripted. So brace for it. But I'm the Veterans Program Manager for a federal agency, right? And I've been asked this question myself in interviews, and I know how I answer, but I'm not one of you all. And when I say you all, I mean military spouses, right? Because I have never seen a statistic, but I have to believe that the majority of the women in uniform are dual military, more often than not, right? So when they get out, they're now a military spouse. And I have been asked a question by military spouses themselves: do I self-identify as a military spouse when I'm applying for a job? And there's a double-edged sword to that answer. And so I'm curious, because I've been asked it and I know how I answer it, but just real talk, Wendy, what is your advice to women who are wondering if they should self-identify as a mil spouse when they're applying for a job?
Yeah, so I would look at the company. I would start, so I'm not too familiar with the federal. I mainly work with corporate sector. Sure. Yeah. So this would not apply.
The challenges are pretty similar though.
They are pretty similar. And so the one thing I recommend is to look at the company first. You always want to look at the company, right? It's like when you're getting ready to get into a relationship. If you look at the girl's profile or the guy's profile and the guy doesn't go to church, or he's, he doesn't believe or anything, you're not going to start the conversation and say, okay, well, let me tell you all about the Bible. And so the same thing with the company, right? Check if they have a veteran program. That's where you want to begin. If they have a military spouse veteran program. And honestly, Google does all of this for you. You just look up the company. Let's say the company is ABC Company, and then just put military spouse program. If they have a military spouse program, which I'm hoping that a lot of the companies are being vocal about their veterans, and most of them don't, by the way. But if they do, you want to be able to go to that page and use their programs, because this is what happens when you go to that company and you go through the veteran network. You're setting yourself up into a new pipeline, which is a lot smaller than the regular pipeline, which now means that your application is going to be looked at as a military spouse. So, or veteran, if they ask you to choose there. But I always recommend to, yes, identify. And the reason being is because now you are being put in another pool of, resumes. Now they'll say, okay, well, Wendy's resume was really bad, but she's a military spouse. We can kind of understand, she may not know exactly how these will translate, but we're gonna look at it again, put it in front of a hiring manager and see what we get. And so essentially the answer is yes. But now if the company doesn't have a program, right? Let's just say there's no veteran program, then I would try to reach out to someone, go on LinkedIn, see who's on that company and say, hey, Sean, I see that you work for ABC company. Can you tell me a little bit, about your experience there? How do you like working there? And then if, the conversation goes well, try to reach out to at least 3-5 people. Whoever you connect with, and if you're a woman, connect with another woman. They will understand. Say, hey, Wendy, I see that we have mutual connections. Sean also works there. He told me that he loves working there. I want to get your perspective. Do you have a minute or two? And, chat back and forth. And so that's also an opportunity for you to understand. But I honestly would identify, especially if they do have a program, because they're looking for you. There's also, for all military spouses that I'm going to squeeze in here, there's a program called career returnships or just returnships. And I can send you the link to Sean for this.
Please.
The actual name. And these programs are specifically for women that take a break. So this is essentially for all women or that are caregivers, but they also focus on military spouses, which means that they know that there's going to be a gap in the resume. Or even if you're a military woman that decided to take 2 years off because your husband, was also in the military, they know that you had to take that time off and they will bring you through that program. It's like a 6-week program pilot. Each company does it differently. But you get to be hands-on. It's like an internship. They pay you. And if they say, well, Wendy, you're a great candidate. You did a great job. We're going to hire you. So it's a pilot for you to, test as well while you're transitioning or while your husband is transitioning. So I'll send that to you, Sean and Keith.
Great. That's fantastic.
Yes. All right. Well, we are at time, and time flew on this one for me. But before we close out, Sean, do you want to give Sean's final thought, Jerry Springer? Jerry's final thought over there, Sean?
No, I just love what you're doing, Wendy, and the fact that you're helping our spouses, our women veterans, find their footing and help them along the way. Just so powerful. Love what you're doing, and hope you keep doing it for a long time.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you, Keith. No, the pleasure and the honor was mine. This conversation went a little too fast. Like we said, we may need to do this again on my podcast, but thank you so much. And for those of you that are listening, keep tuning in. These guys are honestly putting out a lot of gold out here. So continue to stay tuned. And I'm so happy to be here and look forward to meeting you all.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, we loved having you on, and I'd be happy to reciprocate and come on your podcast as well. So before we close out though, Wendy, one last question for all of our listeners and watchers and viewers out there. What, the folks, especially that are interested in maybe getting in touch with you and learning from your services, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, I want to say LinkedIn. And the reason being is because this also gives you an opportunity to set up your account or even just start practicing to network, right? To connect. And all you have to do is just connect with me. And I promise I'll get back to you and just say, hey, it's great connecting with you because it's something that we need to really build on. And come on and check out the newsletter. I post one out every Monday. So to help you with your transition as well. So please come follow me on LinkedIn under Wendi Wray.
That's awesome. I love that you frame. I'm going to steal that if you don't mind, framing it from, I'm going to make you reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's going to make you start putting some of these things into practice. That's beautiful. I love it. All right. So we are at time, folks. And so on behalf of the Vet SOS family, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Please make sure that you follow and subscribe to us on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms. And remember, don't drown in the sea of transition. Grab the Vet SOS Lifeline.